All right, let's go ahead and get started. It's a little bit after that 9 o'clock hour, so prayer requests, things that aren't in the bulletin, things we need to mention. I have on my list people who are traveling. Lisa Smith, when's she having surgery? July 18th. Carol and Glenn Adams. Ralph, we've got your sister on here. Okay, Cindy? Okay. I'm just going to say Cindy. God knows. Anybody else? Judy?
Mary Noble's sister, Jean, passed away yesterday.
Okay. Sarah?
Priscilla leaves for Africa next Sunday morning.
When's the party?
For the 3 weeks. I'm sorry?
When's the party?
It's as soon as I get back from dropping her off. I'm just kidding.
Okay. Priscilla going to Africa. What else? Becky?
We're going down to Urbana on Wednesday, so the team's going to Urbana on Wednesday.
Okay.
Work with the congregation down there.
Okay.
Billy, my mother's in the hospital.
What's her name?
Florence.
Florence. Okay. Anything else? All right, then, let's pray. Father God, thank you for today. Thank you for allowing us to be here to worship you, Lord. And Lord, I pray that you'll be with us as we do worship, that we will push all those worldly, earthly things that would distract us, that would keep us from giving you 100%. Help us to push those to the side, Lord. And help us when we worship you in just a little bit to focus on you and your Son and everything that you have done for us through him. Lord, I thank you for the ability we have to do that freely in this country without fear. Lord, I pray that you help us not to take that for granted. Lord, I thank you for each person that's here today, whether they're in person or online, for what they mean to you, what they mean to the church. Lord, I thank you for their presence. Lord, I pray that you'll bless them. Lord, I pray that you'll be with those of our number who are sick, whether they're in a hospital or shut in at home. Lord, I pray that you will be with those ministering to them, taking care of them, that you'll give them comfort, especially mindful of Ralph's sister, Cindy. Pray that you'll be with her in her situation. Pray that you'll be with Carol and Glenn Adams. Pray that you'll be with Lisa Smith. Pray that you'll be with Will's mom, Florence. Pray that you'll just be with all those situations and any others that either we don't know of or forgot today, Lord. I just pray that you'll help the doctors in each one of those situations to do what they've been given the ability to do, and if it's your will, that healing will come. Lord, I pray that you'll be with those that are traveling, whether they're on vacation or especially mindful of the teens who are going to Urbana, that you'll give them a safe journey, help them to just enjoy the time that they have fellowshipping together, and especially to enjoy the time they have serving you. Pray that you be with Priscilla as she goes to Africa and does the same, that you will help her to be safe and to bring her home safely to Sarah at the appropriate time. Lord, pray that you be with Mary Noble's family as they mourn the passing of Jean. Pray that you'll give them comfort and strength, and just be with Mary and just watch over her. Help us to put our arms around her and comfort her as well. Lord, I pray that you be with all those that have recently lost loved ones, that you will comfort them, give them strength, help them as they adapt to this new way of life, Lord. I pray that you will just help us to do what we can to be there for them. Lord, thank you for your Son. Thank you for all he's done for us. Thank you for the hope we have in him, and I pray that you'll send him back soon. It's through your Son I pray. Amen. All right, so we're in Acts chapter 10. No PowerPoint today, so if that's what you like, I'm sorry. Don't leave. We're in Acts chapter 10, and we're at this point in the story where we've reached this this discussion about this soldier named Cornelius. And this is a major turning point in the early life of the church. Thus far, we've mostly seen preaching to Jews. We've mostly seen preaching to people who are Jewish descent. We've seen preaching to proselytes. But now we're going to see wide-scale preaching to Gentiles. And we're going to see that preaching move beyond Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria. And there's a verse that I want to throw out there to you to kind of help set the stage for where we're at today. And that's coming from Ephesians chapter 2. I'm going to read that to you. It says, "So that at that time you were Gentiles in the flesh, called the uncircumcised by those called the circumcised, which is done in the flesh by human hands. At that time you were without Christ, excluded from the citizenship of Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of promise, without hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he is our peace, who made both groups one and tore down the dividing wall of hostility. In his flesh he made of no effect the law consisting of commands and expressed in regulations, so that he might create in himself one new man from the two, resulting in peace. He did this so that he might reconcile both to God in one body through the cross, by which he put the hostility to death. He came and proclaimed the good news of peace to you who were far away, and peace to those who were near. For through him we both have access in one Spirit to the Father. So then you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with the saints, and members of God's household, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the cornerstone." So when Paul's writing that, he is talking to those Gentiles who are now part of the family of believers. And he uses some very interesting language there. He talks about this dividing wall between Jews and Gentiles that was the law of commandments contained in ordinances. In other words, under the old law. God had made a special covenant with the Jewish people and given them the law of Moses as a part of the plan of bringing the Messiah into the world. And Gentiles, whether they liked it or not, were not included in that covenant. Some Gentiles could become Jewish proselytes, but the law still stood as this impenetrable barrier between them and the Jews. And Jesus came to break that barrier down. Remember when he died on the cross? He tasted death for everyone, Hebrews 2:9. So legally, at the cross, that wall was broken down. But practically, it's another story. And practically, at Caesarea in Acts chapter 10, that's when the wall starts to crumble. To put it another way, God in his mind saw at the cross this wall come down, but sometimes it takes a while for men to get it. And that's where Acts chapter 10 comes in. You know, part of the problem is that the Jews, even with God setting them apart, had added to this wall, if you will. If you think about this, the law taught them they were God's chosen people. They took it a step farther and said, that means we're better than everybody else. The law said, you have to be separate. That meant to them, we're going to despise other people and look down on them. So they had erected these man-made barriers of pride, prejudice, property that became almost more formidable than the one that God had erected through the law. But Acts chapter 10 sets the scene for how this wall gets broken down. So in thinking about that, somebody read for us Acts chapter 10, verses 1 and 2.
In Caesarea there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion, in what was known as the Italian regiment. He and all his family were devout and God-fearing. He gave generously to those in need and prayed to God regularly.
All right. So we got the stage set here for this guy named Cornelius. And what's it say about Cornelius? Who was Cornelius? What was his occupation? Centurion. That helps us to set and know who this guy is. He was a soldier. He was a soldier with about 100 men under his command. Scripture says he's a centurion. Centurion means you're the boss of about 100 men if you look at this in further, it also says he was a member of what cohort? The Italian cohort. If you know your history, this tells us that these were soldiers whose loyalty to Rome would have been unquestioned, because they are Italian men. They were from that sect. They were true Roman men. So they were probably, if anything, not just regular soldiers. These guys are probably the governor's bodyguard, based on their type of cohort. They are men whose loyalty to Rome would have never been questioned. And being that almost 100 years before, Rome had come in and conquered Palestine, this guy Cornelius is part of that army that's continuing its occupation of the Jewish lands. So that tells us this guy's occupation. What do we know, and you sort of touched on it, about his character? Somebody said devout. Who said devout? Okay, Laura and Janet said that. So this term devout, if you were to look this up in Greek, this word here is found only 2 times in the New Testament. Here and 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. When Peter says, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly, that's where that translation comes in, from temptation. So this is a guy who feared God. A true Roman who feared God. And not just him, but what's it say? All of his house. So he had come to know Yahweh, and he was praying to him. There were 2 kinds of proselytes that could become practicing Jews. There was the proselyte at the gate, who was a person who was limited in their obedience to the law given to the Jews. They would obey the law, but they weren't circumcised. And there was a proselyte of righteousness. This is one who had accepted full responsibility of the law and also been circumcised. So we aren't sure what kind of man Cornelius was. Many think that he was probably a proselyte of the gate, just based on his occupation, who he was, where he came from. But it's also possible that he'd been circumcised. Do you notice anything else about this guy? He was generous. Verse 2, he gave many alms to the poor, to the people. So here you've got a Roman soldier occupying Palestine land, and what's he doing? He's taking care of his occupants, the ones he's there to be over. Is that normal? I think most of us would say that's probably not normal behavior from a Roman soldier during this time. What else do you see about this guy? Prayed regularly. Prayed to God, probably keeping the Jewish hours of prayer. Remember, the Jews prayed 3 times a day: morning, afternoon, evening. So this guy's praying regularly. Anything else? I think there's a couple other things about this guy we see.
Fear of God.
He had the fear of God. So a Roman soldier who feared God. Wow. That's something. Verse 22 says he was well spoken of by the entire nation of the Jews. So those who knew him spoke highly of him. With these traits, is it easy to think, man, this guy should be a Christian? I mean, he's a good, God-fearing man, right? You ever heard anybody say, I'm a good person? You get where I'm going with that? I'm a good person, I should be okay. He did everything he was supposed to do. He took care of people, he prayed to God, people liked him, but there was something missing. Do you notice too, here's a God-fearing man praying to God that wasn't a Christian? Does that stand out to you at all? Ralph? Yeah, he just doesn't quack like it, does he? Okay? So we've got this guy. This is the scene. Let's look at verses 3 and 4. Somebody read verses 3 and 4.
About the ninth hour of the day, he saw clearly in a vision an angel of God coming in and saying to him, Cornelius. And when he observed him, he was afraid and said, What is it, Lord? So he said to him, Your prayers and your alms have come up for a memorial before God.
So here's this guy Cornelius. He's doing his regular prayers about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and he gets this appearance. Now, let's just be straight. If this happened to any of us, would that kind of make us nervous and scared, or maybe shocked or surprised, or any of the adjectives you want to use? I'd be, what's going on here? And then this angel comes in, and what's the angel say to him? I find this interesting. Yeah, he says Cornelius. What's he say about his prayers and his offerings? They've been noticed. Your prayers are a memorial offering before God. They've ascended as a memorial offering before God. How were his prayers a memorial? Does that catch anybody else? Jill?
I thought, as I was reading this, I've been studying for this, I thought to myself, what is that? Well, to me, it's sort of like if you go to a funeral home and you give a donation in that person's name, what he was doing was giving things to others in recognition of God.
Yeah. The things that he's doing, the actions that he's taking, God's noticing. Kind of like a donation at a funeral. Or maybe a donation to help somebody have surgery or take care of a bill. Except in this case, the master of the universe is noticing this and catching on. Now, these memorials, I think it's safe to say, were reminding God, maybe in the figurative sense of his plan to bring the Gentiles into the fold. Because in a sense, God doesn't forget. But in an accommodative sense, the prayers and alms were saying, all right, I see this guy. This is who we're going to start with. Because this is a good example. Look at verses 5 and 6. Look at what this angel says. Now send men to Joppa and call for Simon, who is also named Peter. He is lodging with Simon, a tanner, whose house is by the sea. So we get this vision, and Cornelius is told to go send for Simon. But just to be clear, since lots of people are named Simon, you're looking for Simon, who's also called Peter. And he happens to be staying with this guy named Simon, who's a tanner. Now, we talked about this Simon the tanner. I ended on this last week as something to notice. Does anybody remember why this was significant, that Peter was staying with a tanner?
Because he was made considered unclean.
Considered unclean? Who was? Okay. So Simon the tanner would have been considered unclean. Does anybody understand why? Laura, you want to expand on that?
Because he worked with dead animals.
Yeah. So a tanner would often be found near the sea, near a river, near a lake, somewhere where they could use water to conduct their trade. And they were often thought of as unclean people because they were constantly handling unclean dead bodies. It's even rumored, according to what I studied, that if a man married a woman and didn't tell that woman what he did for a living, and that woman found out he was a tanner, under the law, that could be cause for divorce. Because you'd always be unclean. That's how looked down on these people were. But Peter's staying with this guy. Do you think that was God starting to go, Peter, let me get your attention, man? I think it was. I don't think it was coincidence. So then this angel says, go find Simon Peter. He's staying with a tanner by the sea. You'll know him when you get there. Look at what Cornelius' response is. Somebody read verses 7 and 8.
When the angel who spoke to him had gone, Cornelius called 2 of the servants and a devout soldier who was one of his attendants. He told them everything that had happened and sent them to Joppa.
So, as soon as this angel departs, Cornelius waits around and gives it a little bit of time. Right? I'm seeing if anybody's awake. No! Immediately, he obediently responds, sends 2 servants, 1 devout soldier, and says, go find this guy named Simon Peter. And he tells them everything that happened in that vision and sends them on their way. And this is later in the afternoon, remember? This is about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But Cornelius was so struck by what this angel said, they didn't even wait for the next day so they could not have to travel at night. So Cornelius responds immediately. Is there any truth that's becoming clear here about this Cornelius guy? Think about Romans 1:16. For I am not ashamed of the gospel because it's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jews and also to the Greek. Got this guy here who's very pious, very devout, says his prayers, takes care of people, and this angel comes to him and says, we're going to do something for you. You're not quite there, man. Now, if that was us, would we always respond obediently like that?
If an angel said that, yeah.
Maybe. Or would you be offended that all the stuff that you're doing isn't enough? Just saying. Because sometimes that's how our minds work, isn't it? This angel had the nerve to tell me I'm not doing enough, and there's something else I've got to do after the shock and awe is over. It'd be easy to criticize people like that, but hey, the Israelites had God blasting on a mountain right beside them, and they still forgot. So this Cornelius is something special. In this story, in Acts 11:14, Peter says, the words I told him are what made him saved. God is going to bring him a preacher so he can hear the gospel and be saved. Yes, sir, Matt.
You know, I wonder, I never thought about it, I wonder if pride is incompatible with fear. You know, you asked if we saw an angel, you know, would we, or if this happened to us, would we feel the same way? And I just think, man, if I was like so, not scared, but like, we're supposed to have the fear of the Lord, you know? And for whatever reason, Cornelius, it says he had the fear of the Lord. And so if I understood the power and majesty, and that caused this reverent fear, you know, and then some angel or something showed up and said, you need to go do this, man, I'd like to think I'd say, well, I'm going to go do that, you know. But to be in a state of just kind of not fear, just, I don't know.
Okay. Kind of have to process it maybe, wouldn't we? Some of us would. I got to process this whole thing. Some of us would react just like Cornelius immediately. Others of us might, what did he really mean?
I think it could speak to how much he really wanted to know more about God as much as he could.
Yeah.
He immediately wanted to go there and know as much as he could.
So Jill says it speaks to how much he really wanted to know and engage more in his relationship with God. It shows you that him being a devout man is not something Luke just made up. This is real. Vicki?
Well, going back to, like when you asked us how we would, like, I don't know if motive is the right word, but like, I think it would depend on how maybe our heart is before all of that happened.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, if I would hope, you know, that if an angel came to me, I'd be like, oh my word, you know, like I need to take care of this right now. But I mean, if I'm not mentally there when this angel comes to me, then obviously I have a little more work to do than I thought I did. and maybe my, again, I don't know if motive is the right word, but maybe my motive for what I am doing, you know, even though so like, I guess you can say you're God-fearing, and you can say, people can say you're devout because they see all these things on the outside, but if your heart really isn't right with God, then I don't think that the thing, like, you know, going right away or answering right away or maybe being fearful when you see this angel is how it would have happened.
I think you're right. I'm going to build on that. Are we always in a state of mind where we're ready to accept what God pushes us to do? No, we're not always like that. Sometimes it takes a little more oomph or motivation or maybe a kick in the rear. So we're not always in that mindset. So for us, the lesson at this point is try to work to be in that mindset. Because Cornelius was in that mindset to readily accept what this angel said to him and move forward. Ralph?
I was going to offer a slightly opposite way to look at it. I think that's all good. But keep in mind that Cornelius might feel validated in a way, because the angel started out by saying, your gifts have been noticed.
Mm-hmm.
And so he might, you know, how many times do we sometimes pray or do things in our devotion to God and wonder, you know, am I doing the right things? Am I being noticed by God? Well, he gets an angel that says you are. So that's, in some ways, you know, you can always look at things in your life two different ways.
Sure.
Look at the negative side, look at the positive. He can look at the positive side and say, yeah, God is real and he noticed me. And that's an awesome thing. Rather than saying, what, I got to do something else. He might be motivated, he might be energized. Yes, God noticed me.
So it goes back to whichever perspective you're in. The perspective of being ready and open to do whatever, and the perspective of saying, I'm just not at that point right now. Robert?
I believe God chose us before the foundation of the world.
Yeah.
And this takes me back to the rich man, where he asked that somebody, you know, be sent back to his brothers. And he said, man, even if somebody rose from the dead, that's not going to change their minds.
Yeah. So it's all about the mindset again. Right? Is that what you're getting at, Robert?
Yes.
It's all about the mindset. Do you notice that it only took one time to get through to this guy? If you're familiar with the story, that should stand out to you. Okay? Because look at what happens next. Chapter 10, verses 9 and 10. Somebody read that.
The next day, as they went on their journey and drew near the city, Peter went up on the housetop to pray about the 6th hour. Then he became very hungry and wanted to eat, but while they made ready, he fell into a trance.
So Peter, at about noon the next day, while those 3 people are traveling to see him, goes up on the roof, and in Eastern houses back then, they had access to the roof outside so they could use that as a place to entertain, stay, sleep, do whatever. Peter's up on this rooftop. He's up there praying. It's about noon, and it says that he became hungry and fell into a trance. I can identify with that. Maybe you can too. Thank you for laughing, Vicky. So he falls into this trance. Now the Greek word here is ecstasis, which over time has been translated into English as ecstasy. And it literally means standing outside of oneself. So this might be someone who's trying to tune a radio station to get the signal in more clearly, if anybody still knows how to do that. I can't use that reference in the teen room. So Peter's up on this roof. He's in this trance. He's praying. And verses 11 and 12 say this. He saw heaven opened, and an object that resembled a large sheet coming down, being lowered by its 4 corners to the earth. In it were all the 4-footed animals and reptiles of the earth and the birds of the sky. So in this vision, Peter sees this large sheet coming down from heaven, and it contained all kinds of animals. What the Old Testament would have called clean and unclean. Now, this is where we've got to go back and look to that part of Leviticus that everybody breezes through when they're doing their daily Bible reading. Leviticus chapter, maybe you don't. If you don't, I apologize. Leviticus chapter 11 tells us, and Deuteronomy 14 tell us, according to the old law, the regulations on how to distinguish between clean and unclean animals. And we could spend a lot of time looking at these regulations. For example, Leviticus chapter 11, verses 27 and verses 3 through 8. Any beast that doesn't have the hoof, the part of the hoof entirely, and that chews the cud, including all that go on four paws, can't eat those. This allows, though, the eating of the ox, sheep, goats, deer, and gazelles. Leviticus 11, 20 through 23. Any winged insects that do not have, in addition to the four legs, two hind legs for leaping. So basically anything that's not a locust or a grasshopper, you can't eat. Some of you wouldn't even eat the locust or grasshopper. You can't eat carnivorous birds. And Leviticus 11, 13 through 19 lists about 20 of them. And they even include a bat as a bird. Okay? Then you get to the water-fit fowl. Leviticus 11, 9 through 12. Anything in the water that does not have both fins and scales. So if you like catfish, can't eat it under the law. Sorry. That stinks. This prohibition, though, allowed for the use of allowed for them to eat some of the wholesome varieties of fish that were found in the water around Palestine. Those categories were unclean under all circumstances, but even under some circumstances, the flesh of clean animals could become unclean. So the law prohibited the eating of things sacrificed to idols, anything that was strangled, anything that was clean that touched something unclean couldn't be eaten. Blood and flesh of bird and beast were sacred to the Lord. You couldn't eat the blood of any animal or bird. Now, as I read this, I'm sitting here thinking, well, what about people who like their steak medium rare? I mean, think about it. You couldn't eat any of that. And if you were an offender of these laws, according to Leviticus 11, 24 and 25, it says, these will make you unclean. Whoever touches their carcasses is unclean until evening, and whoever carries any of their carcasses is to wash his clothes and will be unclean until evening. So under the old law, do you think God was pretty serious about this? I think it's safe to say that. Now, I present all that to you because when you think about how serious God was about distinguishing clean and unclean animals, it makes me be a little less harsh on Peter's reaction. Because you think about this, that's how Peter grew up. That's how he was trained. Have that mindset as we read this. Somebody read verses 13 through 16.
A voice said to him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." "No, Lord," Peter said, "for I have never eaten anything impure and ritually unclean." Again, a second time, the voice said to him, "What God has made clean, do not call impure." This happened 3 times, and suddenly the object was taken up into heaven.
So in this trance, Peter's told 3 times, arise, kill, and eat. This education of Peter took some repetition. Remember I said the student only took 1 time? The preacher, the teacher, took him 3 times to get through to him. In other words, what God's saying here is, Peter, I know you're hungry. Here's a smorgasbord direct from heaven. Pick out what you want and eat it. But what's Peter's reaction? By no means, Lord. By no means. Now, I find that contradictory, because if you're going to tell God, by no means, can you really call him God? That's a whole other lesson. But think about why Peter reacted this way. I've already touched on this. He's rigidly following the law. Don't eat things deemed unclean by the law. For Peter's Jewish mind, God was nullifying the dietary Jewish laws. Can you imagine how difficult this would have been for Peter? I mean, think about this. This isn't very far off from how some of us were raised. Maybe not about food, but some other things. All this stuff I've told you since you were born, you can go ahead and do. That's a shell shock. That's a boom right in your face for Peter. If we've ever been in this position before, this would be difficult for us. There's no way Peter would have gotten up, killed, and eaten one of any of these animals without this lesson, the way this was taught to him. I mean, think about it. They're not even making them kosher according to the Jewish law. And this vision is saying, get up and eat. And then God goes one step further and says, what I have made, don't call unholy. Now, remember how I started the lesson looking at Ephesians? All persons who were not Jews, how were they viewed? As unclean. Unclean rabble. People shut out from God's covenant. Whatever practices these common people engaged in that differed from those of the chosen people were called common things. And if these common things that they practiced were forbidden by the law, then those things were especially known as common. This distinction between clean and unclean meat, which formed a considerable part of the Mosaical law, is not being abolished. So one of the great barriers of separation between Jew and Gentile is being removed. Paul emphasizes this point in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 3 and 5. Do we realize that Jesus himself laid the groundwork for this in Mark chapter 7? Somebody turn to Mark chapter 7 and read 14 through 23. Thanks, Joe. So Jesus said back in Mark 7, nothing that goes into a person can defile him, but the things that come out of a person are what defile him. Now, I would have loved to have been there when Peter, through the Spirit, saw this vision, remembered these words, and went, oh boy, I get it now. Because you know he did that. You know as he reflected back on the lessons that these things started to make place, to make sense. But God still had to send this vision for the full implication to sink into Peter. God's about to make clear to Peter and to us that he's working outside of and beyond Israel. And if Peter wants to be a part of what God's doing, he needs to understand nothing is unclean. So in looking at this vision, what do you think the point of this vision is? Because I think there's some surface level points and some deeper meanings to this vision. What do you think?
People are all equal. He's trying to say God does not have favorites.
There's a deeper meaning. People are all equal. God does not have favorites. There's no distinction. No, this person's unclean or that person's clean because of the color of their skin, the place where they come from, who they are, where they grew up.
You could even go further and say God doesn't look at the works. Cornelius was a good man, devout, God-fearing, prayed, but he lacks the one step.
Yeah. There's another deeper meaning if you didn't hear it. Cornelius was doing great works. Was that enough? Not at all. On the surface, this is God saying, you know, that Mosaical law of ritual cleanness, we're throwing that out the door. And it's got to get through to you Jews that on the surface is gone. But deeper, things that are unclean are now clean. You Jews don't look at these people this way anymore. What sets you apart is your relationship to Christ, not your obedience to the law. This is people just as much as it is food. Do we practice this? Boy, we're still struggling with it today in 2023, aren't we? As I sit here and read this, I'm sitting here going, why couldn't we get this years and years and years ago? And we still struggle with it. But it's getting through to Peter. And again, took one time to get to the student, took 3 times to get to the preacher or the teacher. So just because you've been in the group for a while or because you've got understanding doesn't mean you're always ready to listen. Sometimes we need something more than that. Sometimes we need to be clocked upside the head, figuratively. Anything else you notice from this passage? It's going to get deeper as we keep digging into this guy named Cornelius. Next week, Peter's going to go back and see this guy. And I hope you catch the light bulb moment as you're studying through it this week, because next week we're going to finish verses 17 through 48 of chapter 10. And Peter's going to have his light bulb moment. And it'd be nice to say that this is when Peter got it. But if you've studied before, you know Peter didn't necessarily get it. And he had to be reminded a couple more times. But he's on the path. Any other thoughts before we finish?
It only took, what, 8 to 10 years at this point?
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah. I mean, what is this? This is about 8 to 10 years. That's a good point, Luann. This is about 8 to 10 years after Christ's crucifixion. And Peter's still struggling with it. So give him a little bit of grace. Some of us get in that same mode, same way of doing things. It's how we've always done it. Mindset. Anything else? All right, y'all. Thank you. We'll end right there and have a good worship.